The idea that I want to talk with you tonight about is risk. Ultimately, this presentation is about risk. But it's not about risk in the way that conventional risk analysts think about it. The whole notion of extreme risk is tied up with a change of a trend. It might be a financial trend, it might be a social trend, but we're focusing on when trends flip from the current trend to its opposite, the so-called critical points. But in fact, we know that surprises always happen. And where do they happen? They happen at those very rare instances when the current trend is rolling over. And the faster that trend rolls over and the quicker it moves into the opposite trend, the closer you become to an extreme event, a surprise, a shock, a discontinuity. And so that's what I want to talk about, is not the trending points. I want to talk about just the opposite, where there's real action and real information, where the critical points are when trends are changing. Now, turning points or X events are a particular kind of an event. But in fact, events in general all have the same basic character. They're a combination of chance and necessity, or what I've called here a context. There's a context within which events take place, and there's a random element that serves to trigger a particular event from the set of all possibilities. So the context determines what's possible in the next moment of time. The random trigger is what determines, among the possibilities, which one do you actually get? Which one do you actually get? Now, what my contention I want to explore in this presentation is that you cannot predict social events in the same way that you can predict planetary positions in astronomy, because of this random factor. It's without pattern. But what you can do is you can forecast, or you can understand how the context is always changing. And that context is crucial for what kinds of changes of state or what kind of events actually take place from the random input. So I want to focus now on the context and on the idea not of forecasting, but on the idea of anticipating. So I don't believe it's possible to predict social events, but I think it's perfectly possible to anticipate, to understand when you're getting into a danger zone, when you have to start paying more attention because you're near the edge of a cliff. Now, one good way to think about this is to imagine that you have a landscape involving mountains and plateaus and valleys and whatever, and where you are at this moment, you're somewhere on that landscape. And if you happen to be on a nice flat plateau like this table, then even a big random shock, random trigger, if you will, it doesn't move you, it just moves you around on the table, but it doesn't move you up and you don't fall off the edge unless you're very close to it. On the other hand, if you're on a very sharp mountain peak, then it doesn't take much of a push to send you tumbling down into one or another valleys. And I want to talk about how that landscape, because the landscape is always changing in time. It's dynamic. It's not like going to the Alps, which have been there in the same form for centuries. It's like some kind of rubber sheet that's continually being moved about and shifted by certain factors. And the two factors that I think are among the most important are what I call a complexity mismatch, or complexity gaps. And I'm going to explain that with some examples in just a moment. And the second is mood, psychology. I think that the psychology of the population creates these valleys The valleys are not all the same size, but the valleys represent, if you like, the set of all possible things that might happen next. The complexity mismatch contributes to the changing of the landscape, maybe from this tabletop morphing into a sharp peak. And of course then there's the random trigger. So there are these three factors: complexity, which shapes the landscape, part of the landscape; the mood of the population, what the group believes about its future. Are they optimistic, positive about their future? Do they welcome it, or do they fear it? Because those two polarities give rise to completely different shapes of the possibilities for the future that random trigger will set off. So let me now give you a little bit of discussion on both of those factors. First of all, let's start with complexity. And the basic idea is very simple. Tainter observed, he said, societies always face problems. There are always new problems that appear. And the usual method that a society uses to address a problem is they create a new layer of organization whose job is to solve that problem. These layers of solution that are created by governments to solve problems, mostly the solution lasts long after the problem has disappeared. The solution is still there because these layers of bureaucracy, they don't die. And in Vienna, you see this in every government building that you go into. The Kaiser would feel perfectly at home walking into those buildings. He would see a system that he understood perfectly because they're still there, solving problems that don't exist or have long since vanished. Now, what Tainter observed is that since problems are always appearing, the societies keep adding additional layers of bureaucracy, if you like, to solve these different problems until at some moment they wake up and they look around and they say, we are using all of the resources of our society are being consumed maintaining the existing structure. So there's no resources left for the next problem. Well, what happens when the problems continue to appear? Well, you know what happens. Nothing happens because there are no resources for something to happen. So the problem is either ignored or, even worse, it's handed over to some organization whose job was never to solve that problem. But they inherit the problem because there's no resources for a new. And so these problems build up, and at some point the whole society crashes off the edge. That's Tainter's argument. Tainter was talking about a single system, an entire society or an entire civilization. I put a little more resolution into the problem and said, well, every society is actually composed of many subsystems: transportation, communication, power, water, etc. And these subsystems are in interaction with each other. So, and each one of these subsystems has its own level of complexity. And when two systems, for example, interact, there's a complexity gap that emerges because they don't have the same level of complexity, and the level of complexity is always changing. It's dynamic. And so as long as the levels are approximately the same, then there's not too much stress and everybody lives sort of happily, not necessarily ever after, but at least for a while. But since the complexity levels are always changing, at some point a gap emerges between the high complexity and the low complexity system that is unsustainable. It's like stretching a rubber band. You pull a rubber band and at some point you start feeling in your muscles in your arm that I'm getting nearer the edge. And if I keep foolishly pulling on this rubber band, it's going to break. I'm going to have a crash. And the only way to avoid it is to reduce that tension. And in social terms, it essentially means to downsize. But human beings aren't very good at downsizing. That's not in our nature to downsize. And so generally speaking, what happens is this gap grows and grows and grows until at some point you get a crash. Nature steps in and says, if you will not voluntarily reduce this gap, then I have to do it for you. So anyway, this is the idea of complexity overload and complexity gaps. Now let me show you a couple of examples. Well, here's one that we all know about, Fukushima, which was an earthquake, tsunami, and a meltdown of the power plant due to flooding. The barriers against the tsunami were too small, too short. Another kind of meltdown we're also familiar with, the Eurozone. Two different meltdowns, but the same basic phenomena at play. Two systems in interaction where the complexity gap becomes too big and you have a crash. Now here's what they are. For the Fukushima, the two systems essentially were nature and the safety system for that nuclear plant. Now, some might say, well, this event was caused by this big earthquake and the tsunami that was generated. My statement is, no, that wasn't the cause of the event. It was a human error, and the human error by the Japanese planners, it has several parts, but two of the main parts are, first of all, in their planning, they never conceived of the idea that they might have an earthquake bigger than any earthquake that had ever happened before. So their planning was based on the biggest earthquake we've ever seen in the past. Well, unfortunately, nature gave them something bigger than that, and a bigger tsunami as well. So with the planning already for an earthquake that was too small, then the safety systems, especially the retaining walls to keep out the water from the tsunami, they were too short, too low. And even worse, the pumps that were supposed to pump out any water that happened to come over, they were down below sea level, behind the wall. So as soon as the wall gave up, the pumps were immediately completely underwater. They couldn't pump anything. So this was a compounding of a lot of human errors. And as a consequence, you had high complexity, let's say, in nature, and too low complexity in the safety system, and the gap was too big, and you had this crash. The Eurozone is a little different story, but it's the same basic message. You have one system, namely the Eurozone countries, that have too low a complexity. There are too many things that they cannot do because they're members of the Eurozone, like inflating their currency, imposing tariffs, and so on. And the outside world is not restrained by those kind of conditions, and so the outside world essentially has a greater complexity than the Eurozone, and that gap widens to the point where you may have a Fukushima-style meltdown. Hasn't happened yet, but I wouldn't put any money, literally, on it not happening. Now, let me shift gears and talk a little bit about psychology. I said that the second element of shaping the valleys, the space of possible events, it's strongly conditioned by the idea of what is the belief held by the group or the society about its future. But I like much better to base the idea of measuring social mood not on what people say, but what they do, the actions they actually take. And one of the best ways, not the only way to do this, but one way that I used in a book called Mood Matters that I wrote a couple years ago, was to say, just look at the financial market index. Look at the ATX index in Vienna, or look at the Dow Jones Industrial Average in New York. And think about, what does that index actually represent? Well, the index represents bets that people are making about the future on every time scale. So day traders, flash traders, long-term investors, and whatever, they all come to the market, they give their order, it's a bet about what they believe about the future on some time scale. And financial markets are very effective at collecting together all these bets and synthesizing them into a single number, a change of price. So that change of price is a measure of what people are thinking about in the future. I put on this slide a couple of headlines from a couple of years ago because one of the things that people always ask me about in using the financial market index, and so since I'm going to make a preemptive strike and give the answer to this question before you ask it, so that we don't have to have this question. And the question is, well, how can you say that the actions of a handful of traders in some down in Wall Street reflect the beliefs of the whole society about the future? After all, the number of actual traders in the society is a microscopic or even nanoscopic fraction of the total population. How can their actions reflect the whole population? Now, in my book, Mood Matters, you can see a long answer to this question, but the short answer is those traders are not disconnected from the rest of the society. They're part of the society. And those traders, they watch TV, they read newspapers, they have friends that they go down to the bar on the corner and have drinks with, they talk to their family and whatever, and they get input from people all over on what's happening in the world. And this input has an effect on their beliefs about the future. And this slide tells about work that people have been doing in what's now called big data, in mining big databases like Twitter, and characterizing the messages that you see in Twitter into different categories of optimistic or pessimistic and so on. And what the researchers who've done this are discovering is that, remember, these messages are now from individuals in the population. They're not just from traders, they're from everybody. Well, everybody who talks on Twitter anyway. And what they discover is these Twitter feeds are quite good, quite highly correlated, in this case positively correlated, with what the financial markets will be doing 3 days from now. So what you see in the Twitterverse today is a signal, or it's a leading indicator of what the financial markets are going to be doing in a couple days from now. That's the general message. So this early research on big data, if it holds up, it's very encouraging because it basically says it's not so bad to think about the financial market index as a measure of social mood because it's reflecting what these individuals in this big social media database are actually saying and doing. Okay, so with that out of the way, let me show you a couple of examples. Here's one that I like. I call it the skyscraper index. And what you see on this picture, the background to this is that often you see when you see a, let's say, relatively small but prosperous country growing economically, they undertake the mission to build the world's tallest building. They essentially want to say, hey, pay attention to us, we're here also. And one cheap way to get that attention is to build the world's tallest building. And superimposed on each of these pictures, the red line is the financial market index in the corresponding place. So at the top, it's the Kuala Lumpur Stock Index. In the middle, it's the TAIEX Index in Taiwan. And at the bottom, it's the Dubai Index. And those blue arrows, the first blue arrow on the left marks the moment when construction actually started on this building. Not when they started talking about it, but when they actually started taking action, when the first shovelful of dirt came out of the ground. And the second arrow on the right, the second blue arrow, is when the building was topped out, when it was declared open for business. And what you see in each case is that when the construction began, the financial markets, there was enormous optimism. People in those, they were positive. They had optimism for the future. But of course, these buildings don't get built overnight. And by the time the buildings are finished, in each case, and I could add, I didn't put it into the last one because this slide needs a little updating, but in each case, by the time the building was finished, the financial markets had already fallen off the edge. The positive mood had given way to fear of the future, not optimism for the future. Now, somebody asked me in a talk earlier today about the European Union. So now this is a more interesting example than the skyscraper index. What do I believe about the future of the European Union? And so I'm going to show you a couple of pictures now which illustrate my beliefs. My beliefs are not very positive, I have to admit. Not very positive for the continued existence of the European Union. That might be very positive for some people, but for those who like the European Union, not too positive. So here's the background. Since about the year 2000, the long-term social mood in both North America and in Europe has been in a kind of declining state. Now, it doesn't mean that in between, on the shorter time scales, there haven't been some counter-trend movements, but on long-term time scales, say measured in decades, the general trend is downward. So the kind of events that you could expect to see would, on the long-term scale, would be of the type not global, local, not joining, fragmenting, and so on, not welcoming but rejecting. And here's a picture for the European Union, one picture. And this is the stock index that's appropriate for Europe. It's not an American index. It's the Euro Stoxx 50 index, which is a measure of the 50 biggest companies in Europe. And what you see on this picture, I'm sorry, it has a lot of writing on it, but what's marked here are places where sort of, you would say, nice things have happened in connection with the European Union, even when it was first founded back in 1957, the Treaty of Rome. This was a time when the index was moving up. People were optimistic. And so these arrows across the top, they're all places where the Europeans, as measured by the Euro Stoxx index, was positive. Across the bottom are events or newspaper headlines in some cases where it was not so good times for the European Union. And almost without fail, those are places where the social mood was moving downward, like here. So I want to zoom in a little bit on this and show you just more or less this part of it, which is the part we care about right now. So here's what it looks like. So this thing begins in 1998, and here you have a very big peak in 1990, around 2000. The European Union launches a common currency. Treaty of Nice clears the way for expansion. This is a globalizing, a joining kind of event. It's not a separating event. And then here again, in 2007, 2006, 12 new countries are added to the European Union in another period of great optimism for the future. Unfortunately, now we come to today's times. This whole picture is sort of flattened out. And in fact, if anything, it's down, not up. And what do you see in this period? You don't see nice things for the European Union. You see localizing and separating kind of events, all these bailouts and people saying, well, we don't want to spend our money on these lazy Greeks and Spaniards and so on. A kind of fear or pessimism about the future. I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I'm pretty sure if I went to sleep today and woke up in 10 years, one of the things I would not expect to see is a European Union or anything even similar to what we have in place today. I think some parts of what we have in place today will survive. I don't think it will be a common currency. That will not be one of the survivors. But maybe border controls and things, freedom of motion and so on, that may survive. I can't say, but I'm not very optimistic. So now I'm contrarian enough to say I think that these extreme events, these crashes, if you like, they're not uniformly bad. They're a problem, all right, no question about that. But they're just as much of an opportunity as they are a problem. And I would even go further and say that human progress is dependent upon the occurrence of these extreme events. If you did not have extreme events, you would not have something that clears away all sorts of stuff in the social structure that doesn't need to be there anymore. And that major change in social structures is always accompanied by some kind of a revolutionary change. Revolutionary, not evolutionary. You never get in a smooth, slow, gradual way anything that looks like major change, major opportunities for innovators, inventors, people with new ideas for services and products and so on. There are no niches for them to step into without having the old order destroyed, essentially, or at least major changes. This is the story of the asteroid that blew away the dinosaurs and our presence here today. If that asteroid had not opened up many new eco-niches for our ancient ancestors, we wouldn't be here today. And first of all, you have to survive the crash. Secondly, you have to have your eyes and ears open to see what are the new possibilities that this crash has created. What are those niches that are now opened up? And thirdly, you have to be a little bit courageous, adaptive if you like, and take some action. Not just look around and say, oh, that's interesting, but basically look in your organization and say, what kind of resources, what kind of energies can I devote to filling one of these new niches that I didn't even know about before? And I don't have time to go into it right now, but the Nokia Corporation is a good example of this kind of thing, for any of you who know the history of that company. They used to build bicycle tires and rubber boots for rainy times in Finland. But all of a sudden, new niches opened up when the GSM cell phone standard was adopted, and Nokia management was eyes open enough to say, hey, we can jump into one of these niches. We have an electronics. It was small, and so they got in quick, and they became, for a while, the world's biggest handset manufacturer. And they decided we're not going to build rubber boots and bicycle tires anymore. We're going to build cell phones for the world, and they did, to some degree. So the basic message is the X events are very often a necessary part of success of an organization. So let me now just summarize this, show you one picture which sort of summarizes everything I've said. We started with trends and asked, well, how does the trend end? And I told you that two of the major factors that shift the context, change the context, are the psychological state of the population, how they believe about the future, and a complexity mismatch that changes the landscape. Now, so then you have this change of context, and then you get a random shock, a trigger. Some fruit seller in Tunisia that burns himself up in the street at just the right moment when the context was perfect for that, and you get Arab Spring. And so then you get an X event. In the case of the Arab Spring, it was political revolution. And that event it's actually destructive. The old order is just blown away. It doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't mean that there's a new order in place. And in fact, in most of those countries, Egypt, Tunisia, there is no new order in place. Syria is another one like this. But eventually it will settle out, and there will be a new order in place. And what happens then, in the meantime, all sorts of new possibilities in the social order have appeared. new niches, if you like. And this is an opportunity. It's not a problem. It's an opportunity for new services, new products, new companies, and so on to enter. And you get then a kind of rebirth of could be a company, could be a country, could be an individual for that matter, but you get reborn. And what happens then? Well, a new trend then a new trend starts. The reason it takes an event, a major disruption, is because in general, those rules of society, if you like, or those old ways of doing things, the power structures in society, the government and the financial people primarily, they like nothing better than preserving the status quo. They're perfectly happy with the system just the way it is now, because they're the biggest beneficiaries of it. This picture is completely consistent with the idea that if you want to have creation, you also have to have destruction. You can't get major creation and changes without breaking. If you want to make an omelet, you've got to break some eggs. And in particular, I think we have to think long and hard and imaginatively about how to generate controlled extreme events, controlled X events. So you get the benefit of the new niches, if you like, but you don't get wiped out by the experiment. And this is a tricky business, but in fact, we engage in this all the time now. For example, people deliberately go out and burn down parts of forests so that the rest of the trees have a better chance of surviving. And finally, you have it the same in raising animals and in agriculture. So with that thought in mind, let me, now that you've heard this great program, you have to have the commercial. Here's the commercial. If you want more information about any of these things, you can have a look at one or another of these books, and you'll get a much bigger and more complete story than what I've been able to give you here.